You think you know why people hate immigrants? Think again. This isn't about borders, laws, or economics. This is about something far more dangerous and far more personal. Because what if I told you that the immigrant you fear is just the disguise your unconscious uses to show you the truth about yourself? That every time you judge someone foreign, you're revealing something hidden, wounded, and unresolved inside you. In this video, I'm going to show you how Carl Jung's theory of the shadow explains xenophobia better than any news report or political speech ever could. And here's the catch. It's not them. It's never been them. The fear, the anger, the discomfort, it all comes from your own conditioning. You're going to learn why societies create enemies when they can't face their own brokenness. How mass prejudice is manufactured through psychological shortcuts. And why the immigrant isn't a threat, but a test. A test of your maturity, your integrity, and your willingness to become something more than just a product of your environment. If you stay until the end, you won't just rethink how you see immigrants. You'll uncover the invisible forces that have shaped your thoughts, your emotions, and your identity your entire life. This isn't a political video. This is a mirror. And once you look into it, you'll never see yourself, or the world, the same way again. There's a strange discomfort that arises when people see someone who doesn't quite belong walking down their street. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's a tightening in the chest, a glance too long, a door locked a little faster. Most won't admit it, but it's there, subtle, silent. Jung would say this unease doesn't come from the immigrant, it comes from within. What we fear in others is often what we've buried in ourselves. The immigrant is not the problem. He is the projection, a living canvas for our unconscious fears. Fear of scarcity, of losing control, of being replaced, of chaos. These fears don't start with policy or economics. They start in the psyche, in the parts of us we've refused to acknowledge. And like all shadows, they demand to be seen. Many working-class people grow up believing that survival is tied to territory, their job, their block, their traditions. So when someone crosses those borders, it triggers something primal. It's not about nationality, it's about identity. The immigrant becomes a walking reminder of how fragile our constructed self really is. If we were truly secure in who we are, we wouldn't feel threatened. But when authenticity is replaced by conditioning, by media narratives, political fear-mongering, inherited prejudice, we no longer see people, we see enemies. That's the shadow at work. And Jung warned, the more we ignore the shadow, the more violent it becomes, especially when it hides under the mask of patriotism, safety, or pride, especially when it whispers in our ear, they don't belong. There's a concept in Jungian psychology called projection. It's when we attribute to others the things we can't face in ourselves. That's what happens with immigrants. People project their fear of inadequacy, their financial anxiety, their insecurity onto an outsider. Think about it. The immigrant didn't cause your job to vanish, or your neighborhood to change, or your rent to rise. But when you feel powerless, you look for someone to blame. And the immigrant, unfamiliar, vulnerable, voiceless, becomes an easy target. He reflects what we can't process: the loss of control, the fear of change, the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. But healing doesn't come from blaming. It comes from confronting. And that confrontation starts not at the border, but in the mirror. A man who's confident in his worth doesn't fear being replaced. A woman who knows her roots doesn't feel shaken by foreign customs. Yet entire nations build walls because they can't build inner peace. Jung believed that societies, just like individuals, have unconscious minds, collective psyches shaped by history, trauma, and silence. When a culture refuses to examine its shadow, it creates myths to justify its fears. They're criminals. They don't share our values. They want to destroy our way of life. These stories are not facts. They are defenses. psychic armor built to protect a wounded identity. And what's terrifying isn't the immigrant. It's realizing how hollow our certainty becomes when it's not rooted in self-awareness. Let's bring this closer to home. Imagine a man raised to believe he must always provide. One day he's laid off. His pride fractures. He walks past an immigrant doing construction work, proud, tired, smiling. That moment stings. But why? It's not envy. It's the sting of inadequacy. The immigrant reminds him of what he used to be, strong, needed, alive. But instead of facing that feeling, he lashes out. Blames, projects. That's the tragedy. Not the loss of work, but the refusal to grieve it. The refusal to grow through it. Jung taught that if we don't make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives, and we'll call it fate. And right now, many people are mistaking projection for protection. So what can we do with this awareness? First, pause before judgment. That immigrant you distrust might carry the same wounds you hide, maybe even deeper ones. Second, notice your language. When you catch yourself using us versus them, stop. Ask, who taught me that? And third, reconnect with your own identity, not the one shaped by fear, but by truth. You're not less safe because someone speaks another language near you. You're more human because you get to hear it. Jung believed the path to wholeness was not in rejecting the other, but in integrating what the other reveals. This isn't about tolerance. It's about transformation. And it begins the moment we choose to see, rather than to fear. There's a cruel irony here. The immigrant, so often hated, is the one offering society a path back to its soul. He forces us to ask, who are we without our illusions, without our myths, without our projected shadows? And most aren't ready for the answer, because to accept it would mean unlearning generations of conditioning. It would mean taking responsibility for the inner war disguised as patriotism. And most of all, it would mean doing the hard work of individuation, not just as people, but as nations. The question isn't whether we can accept immigrants. The real question is whether we can accept ourselves. The parts of us we buried, the fears we denied, the shadow we tried to forget. And maybe that's why the immigrant is so terrifying. Not because he is unknown, but because he makes us face the unknown within. He holds up a mirror to our psyche and asks, silently, gently, is this really who you are? And most people don't want to answer that. Not yet. But if they did, they'd find something surprising. They'd find that the enemy they feared wasn't a person. It was a part of themselves longing to be understood. And this leads us into the next truth Jung warned us about. What happens when the masses, gripped by fear, begin to confuse instinct with ideology? Most people believe their thoughts are their own, but if you sit still long enough and listen, really listen, you'll notice something strange. The voice in your head? The one that forms opinions, casts judgments, whispers warnings. Much of it doesn't belong to you. It's borrowed, inherited, conditioned. Jung warned us about this, the danger of identifying with the collective instead of the self. When a person absorbs society's fears without reflection, they lose their authenticity. And in that vacuum, prejudice takes root. Because when the crowd screams danger, the individual obeys, not out of logic, but out of fear. It's not about truth, it's about safety. But here's the tragedy. Every time we surrender our critical thinking to the mass, we abandon a part of ourselves. Let's break that down. You're walking through a neighborhood and see someone who looks, speaks, or acts differently. Immediately, your mind categorizes them. Foreigner. Not one of us. But where did that thought come from? Was it yours? Or was it downloaded from years of media, family warnings, and political rhetoric? This is the fragmented collective psyche Jung spoke of. A mind shaped not by truth, but by trauma passed down in whispers and headlines. The masses don't think, they react. And when enough people react the same way, it creates a culture. Not a culture of wisdom, but of repetition. Prejudice, then, isn't just a feeling. It's a social reflex, a habit of thought. And habits, when unconscious, become dangerous. In low-income communities, where struggle is daily and uncertainty is the norm, fear becomes currency. And when people feel powerless, they cling to identity like a shield. At least I'm from here. At least I speak the language. These phrases aren't about pride. They're about survival. The immigrant, or anyone who looks like the other, becomes a symbol of disruption, a scapegoat for pain that has no name. That's not evil. It's unprocessed suffering. But when left unchecked, it metastasizes, and the masses, fragmented and afraid, feed off it. They bond over what they hate instead of what they love, over who they exclude instead of who they embrace. That's the architecture of modern prejudice, built not by monsters, but by ordinary people too hurt to heal. And the media, they know this. Fear sells, outrage engages, so they pump the airwaves with half-truths and tribal language, making sure the fire never dies out. Illegals. Invasion. They're changing everything. These aren't just words. They're spells, cast to trigger fear in the collective unconscious. Jung believed that without individuation, humans become puppets of archetypes they don't understand. They act out roles assigned by history, never stopping to ask, is this really me? The immigrant is reduced to a symbol, and the individual, once capable of thought, becomes a shadow of the crowd. And in that shadow, the human heart grows cold, not from malice, but from forgetting how to feel for real people. But here's where things shift. When even one person pauses, just for a moment, and questions the voice in their head, a crack forms in the illusion. A man walking past a refugee camp who wonders, what if that were my child? A woman watching the news who asks, what if I've been misled? These are not weak thoughts. They are courageous acts. Jung called this the awakening of consciousness, the return of the self. It starts slow, quiet, but it spreads. Because truth has a frequency, and once it's heard, it's hard to unhear. That's when the mass loses its grip. Not all at once, but one mind at a time. And yes, it's hard to stand against the tide. It's lonely. You might be mocked, excluded, called naive. But here's the secret. Authenticity always costs. And the cost is worth it. Because once you reclaim your thoughts, your real thoughts, you stop living on autopilot. You stop blaming strangers for the storm inside you. And you start seeing the world not as a threat, but as a mirror. Every person becomes a reflection of what you've embraced, or avoided, in yourself. That's how prejudice begins to dissolve. Not with speeches, but with vision, with awareness, with the courage to question what everyone believes. And when more people do this, when enough individuals awaken from the collective trance, the culture begins to change. Not from the top down, but from the inside out. That's what Jung meant by transformation. Not in laws, but in souls. But the path isn't easy, because every step toward consciousness is a step away from belonging, and most would rather be accepted than awake. Still, some choose differently. They choose the lonely road of the inner journey, the road that leads through fear, through doubt, through the shattered mirror of the collective mind. And what they find on the other side sets the stage for our final, deeper truth. Growth doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes, it walks into our neighborhood speaking a language we don't understand. Sometimes, it wears clothes that feel unfamiliar, or practices customs we've never seen. And yet, according to Jung, that unfamiliar presence is exactly what we need. The shadow, both personal and collective, contains everything we've rejected, everything we've feared, everything we've refused to see. But it's also where our potential hides. The immigrant, far from being a threat, becomes a living invitation to evolve, not just as individuals, but as cultures, as nations, as souls in need of expansion. Real transformation begins the moment we stop resisting the mirror and start learning to look without flinching. To integrate the shadow is to stop pretending, to stop acting like fear isn't present, like judgment doesn't arise. Integration doesn't mean agreeing with everything. It means being honest about what we feel and curious about where that feeling comes from. If someone's presence makes you uncomfortable, don't ask, "Why are they here?" Ask, "Why does this bother me?" That's the path of individuation. Jung taught that becoming whole requires walking toward discomfort, not away from it. The immigrant becomes the test, not of our politics, but of our maturity. And for those willing to do the work, the reward is massive: clarity, healing, peace. But for those who cling to fear, the shadow only grows darker. There's an irony here. What society tries hardest to exclude often holds the exact medicine it needs. Immigrants bring more than labor or language. They bring perspective. They remind us of our own roots, our own fragility, our shared humanity. In low-income neighborhoods, this can be a lifeline. Two mothers from different continents, raising children on the same block, suddenly see their struggle in one another. A factory worker and a refugee share more than they realize. Long hours, low wages, hopes they can barely say out loud. When that connection clicks, something sacred happens. The shadow softens. Judgment gives way to empathy. And culture begins to transform from the inside out. But it's not easy. Integration requires humility. It requires us to admit that we don't have all the answers, that our culture, like ourselves, is incomplete. And that's terrifying, especially for those raised to believe their way is the only way. But Jung's genius was in showing that wholeness isn't about perfection. It's about inclusion, about accepting the fragmented parts, even the ones we wish we didn't have. The immigrant, then, is not a disruption. He is the archetype of the wanderer, the one who crosses borders not just of land, but of consciousness. He brings with him stories, pain, beauty, and resilience. And those who truly listen are changed forever. If you're watching this and thinking, "But I'm just one person, what can I do?" Start small. Learn someone's name. Ask their story. Listen without correcting. Instead of defending your culture, explore it. Why do we do what we do? Who taught us? What have we inherited? And what have we never questioned? Jung believed that to truly grow, we must become aware of what lives in the unconscious. Cultural habits, assumptions, inherited beliefs. These are all psychic material waiting to be integrated. And sometimes it takes the presence of the other to help us finally see what's been hidden all along. This is deeper than tolerance. Tolerance says, "I'll put up with you." Integration says, "You are part of me." And not just you, but what you represent. The fear you awaken, the questions you raise, the discomfort you trigger. Jung would say that every time a society demonizes a group, it misses a chance to become whole, because the demon is not real. It's a symbol, a reflection of what we've buried. And when we choose to confront that symbol with honesty and compassion, something breaks open. A new identity is born. One that isn't afraid of difference, but strengthened by it. One that doesn't erase the past, but builds upon it, consciously. In practical terms, integration means creating spaces for dialogue, not echo chambers. It means seeing immigration not as a problem to be solved, but as a signal of evolution in motion. It means holding two truths at once: that you can love your homeland and still learn from others, that you can honor your roots and still grow new branches. This doesn't dilute culture, it matures it. And that maturity ripples outward, into schools, workplaces, families, and politics. Jung knew that a society unwilling to face its shadow would be doomed to repeat its violence, but one that embraced it could finally become conscious. And perhaps that's the true role of the immigrant, not to fit in, not to be invisible, but to shake the collective psyche awake, to whisper what has long been forgotten, that the world is not divided by borders, but by the stories we tell ourselves. And when those stories change, when they expand, so do we. The shadow, integrated, becomes light, and what was once feared becomes sacred. But that kind of transformation only begins when the mirror is no longer avoided. And if you've followed this far, then maybe you're ready to see what lies beyond the border of the self. So now you know, the fear wasn't about them. It was about you. About all the things you've inherited without question, believed without proof, and repeated without reflection. You've just seen how Carl Jung's theory of the shadow explains not just prejudice, but why entire nations keep repeating the same cycles of fear, division, and denial. And more importantly, how to finally break free from it. But let me ask you this. What part of you are you still refusing to look at? What belief have you carried your whole life that maybe never belonged to you in the first place? Because now you can't unsee it. You can't unfeel this shift. The immigrant isn't your enemy. He's the key to understanding who you really are beneath the surface. And if you're brave enough to keep digging, you'll find a version of yourself that's more whole, more awake, and more free than you ever imagined. So here's your next move. Start paying attention to your projections. Watch what triggers you, then trace it back. That's how you reclaim your mind. That's how you rewrite the story. And if this hit something deep, if this opened even one door inside you, don't walk away from it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because every week we go deeper into the unconscious and bring back tools you can actually use to transform your life.